thunder cracked, and by morning one guest was dead. Welcome to Echo Misteriosa. I am your host, Vela. This community is amazing. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Your voices bring these stories alive. Let's begin. The small village of St. Aldhelm's Rest had never been the sort of place where anything particularly dreadful occurred, at least not since the business of the poisoned scones back in '48, an affair Miss Marple had quietly helped resolve without anyone losing too much dignity. Since then, life had gone on at its gentle, predictable pace. On this particular October evening, however, the wind carried a strange unease. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, and the sky had turned a bruised shade of purple. Curtains were drawn early. Hearth fires glowed behind frosted windows, and those few souls who dared the chill hurried along cobbled lanes, collars up, heads bent. At the heart of the village stood the Old Bell Inn, its sign creaking faintly in the wind. Inside, a gathering was underway. A modest dinner to mark the engagement of Miss Clara Denham, the new schoolmistress to Mr. Peter Hargreaves, a solicitor recently arrived from Bath. The party, though cheerful, had an undercurrent of tension that only someone with Miss Marple's perceptive eye might have noticed. She sat near the fire, knitting needles clicking softly as she smiled benignly at the company. She was not, strictly speaking, a guest, only a neighbour invited by the innkeeper's wife, who thought the event would be cheered by a touch of propriety. The young couple sat at the head of the table, flushed with excitement, but others were not so easily pleased. Mrs. Florence Pritchard, the vicar's wife, had that thin-lipped smile that could slice through conversation. She watched Clara Denham with the look of one assessing a counterfeit coin. Beside her, Major Bristow, retired from the Indian Army, was recounting for the third time his encounter with a cobra in Delhi, a story which grew more dramatic with each retelling. Mr. Leonard Wills, the village postmaster, sat quietly in the corner, his spectacles glinting. He seemed distracted, fingering a folded envelope in his pocket as though debating whether to reveal its contents. And near the window, sipping brandy, was Mrs. Harriet March, a widow of considerable means and even more considerable opinions. She regarded the storm beyond the glass with open disdain. "An ill wind," she murmured, "always brings misfortune. I do hope we shan't be stranded here overnight." Miss Marple, without looking up from her knitting, said mildly, "Oh, but that mightn't be so dreadful, Mrs. March. A storm can often bring people closer together, though sometimes," she added, her needles pausing for just a moment, "it rather depends on what one wishes to keep apart." It was just after 8 when the first crash of thunder shook the windows. The lights flickered, then steadied. Conversation resumed, though more subdued. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else remarked on how atmospheric it all was. And then the door banged open, letting in a gust of wind and rain. And a young constable, breathless, his face pale. "There's been an accident up by the Denham cottage," he announced. "A man's been found, dead, it seems." The room fell silent. Clara Denham rose to her feet, her hands trembling. "Dead? Who is it?" The constable hesitated. "We're not certain yet, miss." "But it looks to be Mr. Hargreaves's clerk, young Mr. Latham. Peter Hargreaves went ashen. Latham! But he was meant to be in Bath tonight." Miss Marple quietly set down her knitting. Outside, the storm broke in earnest, rain lashing the windows as thunder rolled across the moors. Inside, the guests whispered, exchanged glances, and speculated wildly. A servant fetched more candles, and in that flickering light, Miss Marple's eyes gleamed just once, calm, curious, and already considering what manner of accident would bring a young man to his death on such a stormy night. To be continued. Part 2. The village reacts. Would you like me to continue with the next section? The constable's announcement had frozen the room in a heavy silence, as if even the fire dared not crackle. Then came the stir, the shifting of chairs, the murmur of disbelief, the clatter of a dropped fork. Peter Hargreaves pushed back from the table so suddenly that his chair toppled behind him. He looked pale and hollow-eyed, his voice unsteady as he demanded details. But the constable, young and clearly nervous, could offer little. "Found by the hedge near the old lane," he said. "Mr. Latham, I think. Looks like he fell or was struck. Best come at once, sir." Peter hesitated only long enough to grab his coat. Clara, stricken, made to follow. But Mrs. Pritchard caught her arm gently. "No, my dear," she murmured. "Best you stay. Such sights are not fit for ladies." Her tone carried sympathy's faintest chill, like tea gone cold. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had risen without hurry, smoothing the edge of her shawl. "Perhaps I might be of some use," she said softly. "Accidents in weather like this can be complicated." Her calmness seemed to steady the room, if only slightly. The constable nodded uncertainly, grateful perhaps for any sign of composure. And together they stepped into the storm. The rain was relentless. Lanterns bobbed ahead like will-o'-the-wisps, their glow distorted by the downpour. Miss Marple walked carefully beside the constable, her small frame braced against the wind. "You say he was found near the Denham cottage?" she asked, her voice nearly lost to the gale. The constable confirmed it, explaining that a passing farmer had seen the body slumped by the lane. "Didn't want to touch him, miss," the young man said, shivering. "Went straight for me instead." When they reached the scene, Miss Marple saw at once that this was no mere misfortune. The body lay awkwardly beside the hedge, one arm twisted unnaturally. Mud streaked his face, but even through the grime she could see he was young, hardly more than 25. His hat lay some yards away, half buried in the wet grass. There was a deep wound at the back of his skull. The constable, uncertain, bent to examine him. "Perhaps he slipped," he suggested weakly. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the narrow lane. The soil there was soft, but not treacherous, and the hedge rose too high to explain such a wound. "A curious place for a fall," she murmured. "And strange, don't you think, that his shoes are scarcely muddied?" The young officer blinked, glancing down. She was right. The soles were damp but clean, as though he'd not walked here at all. Miss Marple's knitting bag, slung over her arm out of long habit, swung gently as she turned her gaze toward the shadowed outline of the nearby cottage. Light glowed faintly through a curtain. Clara's little home, empty tonight for the celebration. "Perhaps," she said thoughtfully, "he came by some other means." By the time they carried the poor man's body back to the inn, the guests were restless, buzzing with speculation. The storm had trapped them all there, and the room hummed with nervous talk. Mrs. March insisted it must have been a robbery, though she could not name a thief. Major Bristow swore he had seen the young clerk near the window not half an hour before the storm began, though that seemed unlikely, given the distance to the cottage. And Mrs. Pritchard, her lips thin, declared that young men in service often had entanglements. Miss Marple listened from her corner, her needles quiet now. She watched faces instead, the flicker of unease in Peter's eyes, the trembling hand Clara hid in her lap, the sharp glance Mrs. March cast toward the solicitor when she thought no one noticed. Secrets, she thought, were like stains in fine lace. One need only hold them to the light, hold them to the light. When Inspector Graves finally arrived from the nearby town, dripping wet and out of sorts, The guests greeted him with a mixture of relief and dread. He was a large man with a tired patience, and he wasted little time. "Accident until proven otherwise," he declared, though his eyes betrayed uncertainty. He took down statements briskly, his pencil scratching as thunder rolled again overhead. Miss Marple spoke last, her voice gentle, almost apologetic. "You may wish to note, Inspector, that his shoes were far too clean for such a muddy night, and there was no lantern found near him. I've never known a cautious young man like Mr. Latham to walk that road in the dark without one." Graves gave her a thin smile, accustomed perhaps to the elderly offering their observations, but there was a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Noted, ma'am," he said. Later, as the guests were encouraged to stay the night, the storm making travel impossible, Miss Marple sat awake by the fire, her tea cooling beside her. She thought of the wound, the shoes, the cottage light, and of Peter Hargreaves, whose first question had not been of sorrow, but of disbelief. He was meant to be in Bath tonight, he'd said. It was, Miss Marple reflected, precisely the sort of statement that begged to be true. The storm raged on through the night, rattling the panes of the Old Bell Inn, as though nature itself sought entry to the troubled gathering within. Most of the guests had retired, but sleep proved elusive. Doors creaked softly in the corridor, muffled voices rose and fell, and every gust of wind seemed to carry with it a whisper of dread. In the parlour, the fire had burned low, casting long shadows that flickered across Miss Marple's thoughtful face. She had not gone to bed. Sleep was not her habit in times of confusion. Instead, she sat quietly, knitting untouched on her lap, her eyes fixed on the dying embers as she replayed every word, every look, every silence from the evening before. Peter Hargreaves had not returned since accompanying the constable to the scene. Clara, pale and silent, had been taken upstairs by Mrs. Pritchard, who insisted she rest. Yet Miss Marple doubted the girl would find any peace. Engagements often began with excitement, she reflected, but sometimes, tragically, ended before they properly began. A young man dead, another's name already whispered beneath cautious breaths, and a storm that kept them all confined together. It was a night made for the worst sort of revelations. The sound of footsteps drew her from her thoughts. Inspector Graves entered, removing his damp coat and shaking out his hat. "Still awake, Miss Marple?" he asked wearily. "You've the stamina of a much younger woman." "Curiosity, Inspector," she said gently. "It has a most invigorating effect. Have you learned anything more about poor Mr. Latham?" Graves lowered himself into the armchair opposite her. His boots were thick with mud, his manner brisk but not unkind. "A few things. No robbery. His wallet was still in his pocket, and no signs of a struggle, at least not near where we found him. But that wound on his head, it's clean, sharp, more like he was struck than fell." Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. "And the shoes?" The inspector raised an eyebrow. "Still clean, as you said." "Too clean. I'll have them sent for examination in the morning." "There's something else," Miss Marple said softly. "He wasn't wearing gloves, was he?" Graves shook his head. "Then he wasn't planning to be out long," she murmured. "Or he expected to return soon. It's rare in my experience for young men to forget such things on a night like this, which means he must have been called out suddenly, or by someone he trusted." Graves regarded her closely. "You've a sharp eye, Miss Marple. But do you mean to suggest murder?" She looked at him with mild reproach, as though he'd asked whether water was wet. "It is not for me to suggest, Inspector, only to notice." Before he could reply, there came a knock at the parlour door. Mrs. March stood there, wrapped in a fur shawl, her expression a mixture of indignation and fear. "I couldn't possibly sleep with all this commotion," she announced. "And I've something to tell you, Inspector." Something that it may matter." She lowered her voice, leaning forward. "I saw that young man, Mr. Latham, earlier this evening, near the church just before the storm broke. He wasn't alone." Graves straightened. "Not alone, you say? Who was with him?" She hesitated, clearly savouring the attention. "It was dark, mind you, and I didn't have my spectacles, but I could swear it was Mr. Hargreaves. I recognise that coat of his, the brown tweed with the leather collar. They were arguing quite fiercely. I nearly called out, but the rain started and I hurried on. Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten." "You're quite certain?" Mrs. March pursed her lips. "As certain as one can be in bad weather." When she had gone, leaving behind a waft of lavender and self-importance, Graves exhaled slowly. If she's right, that changes things. Hargreaves claims he hadn't seen Latham since yesterday morning. Miss Marple sipped her tea, now quite cold. "Mrs. March's eyes are not what they were," she said mildly. "Yet even poor eyesight can catch truth in outline. If the men did meet, there must have been a reason, and an unpleasant one, judging by the tone she described. It is rarely wise, Inspector, to quarrel near a church." "Symbolically unfortunate," Graves rose, pacing before the hearth. "I'll have to question Hargreaves again, come morning." Miss Marple looked up at him with calm assurance. "Yes, I dare say you will. But tread carefully. The truth has a habit of slipping away when pressed too hard before breakfast." When morning finally came, grey and sodden, the inn was heavy with exhaustion. Guests gathered over weak tea and stronger gossip. Clara appeared last, her face pale as parchment, her engagement ring conspicuously absent. She sat in silence while others speculated around her, her eyes distant. The inspector returned from his early inquiries, looking grimmer than before. "Mr. Hargreaves has been found," he announced to Miss Marple when she approached him by the door. "Down by the riverbank. Alive, but in a bad state. Claims he went out searching after Latham and lost his way in the dark." "Convenient," murmured Miss Marple. "And did he have his coat?" Graves frowned. "No, said he lost it somewhere in the storm." She nodded thoughtfully. "That's unfortunate. It seems that Coat is quite the traveller this evening." Graves gave her a puzzled look, but Miss Marple only smiled, her eyes bright with quiet certainty. "You'll find, Inspector," she said gently, "that the truth about last night's events began long before the storm, and like many storms, it had been gathering for quite some time." As she watched him hurry away, she folded her hands neatly and turned toward the window. The rain had eased, but the village outside looked washed of colour, subdued. Somewhere beyond the mist, a church bell tolled faintly. Miss Marple listened for a moment, then reached for her knitting once more. The pattern, she decided, was beginning to take shape. By late morning, the storm had passed, leaving the village washed clean but uneasy, like a face after tears. Mist still clung to the hedgerows, and puddles mirrored the grey sky. Inside the Old Bell Inn, breakfast was a quiet, strained affair. Forks scraped plates without appetite. Conversations began and died in awkward pauses. The guests spoke in murmurs about the tragedy, though every whisper carried its own slant of suspicion. Mrs. March, ever certain of her own discernment, repeated her story about seeing two men by the church, each time with greater detail than before. Major Bristow snorted into his porridge, insisting that such things were nonsense, pure village hysteria. Yet even he looked uneasy when Peter Hargreaves entered the room. He appeared haggard, his clothes damp and dishevelled, his eyes hollow from a sleepless night. A bandage wrapped around his left hand where, he explained curtly, he had cut himself stumbling in the dark. The others greeted him stiffly, some avoiding his gaze entirely. Clara rose halfway from her chair, but faltered when he did not look her way. The inspector's brief questioning had left its mark. Guilt or exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively near the window, observed him with her usual quiet attentiveness. She noticed how his shoulders sagged not merely with fatigue, but with a kind of defeat. It was not, she thought, the posture of a man plotting a murder, but perhaps of one concealing a different kind of truth. When he poured himself tea, his hand trembled so that a few drops darkened the tablecloth. He did not wipe them. Inspector Graves entered soon after, his expression brisk, and requested to speak with Mr. Hargreaves privately. The two men withdrew to the small study adjoining the parlour, closing the door behind them. The room fell still, save for the faint clink of spoons and the low murmur of rain outside. Miss Marple continued knitting, though her eyes now and then drifted to the closed door. People, she reflected, often reveal themselves not in words, but in how they bear silence. When the inspector emerged half an hour later, his face was set in that professional neutrality Miss Marple knew well. It was the mask of a man with questions he did not yet dare voice. Mr. Hargreaves maintains he left the inn before the storm worsened, he told the gathering. Claims he was heading home when he lost his way and fell. He denies meeting Mr. Latham at all last night. Mrs. March sniffed audibly. Convenient, isn't it? Lost his way indeed. Men don't lose their way in their own village. Graves ignored her. We found footprints along the lane, 2 sets. One appears to match the clerk's size, the other larger, heavier, and there are signs of a scuffle near the hedge. But no weapon yet. A scuffle, Clara repeated faintly. Her face was white. Then he didn't fall, he was attacked. Miss Marple's needles paused. And what of the missing coat, Inspector? Still missing, Graves said, frowning. We'll search the fields again once it clears. Could have been swept off by the wind, though I'll wager it'll turn up somewhere it shouldn't. The group dispersed slowly after breakfast, each retreating to speculation in whispers. Miss Marple, however, asked to step outside. The inspector, already donning his coat again, allowed it. He had learned enough of her reputation not to interfere. Together they walked the lane leading toward the Denham cottage, boots squelching in the soft earth. The morning air smelled of damp leaves and faint smoke from chimneys. When they reached the place where the body had been found, Miss Marple stood very still, gazing down at the hedge. There, she said, pointing to a faint indentation in the mud. You see how one footprint sinks deeper than the other. Whoever stood here lingered. A man waiting, perhaps, or watching. Graves crouched, following her gaze. Could have been the victim. Could have, she agreed mildly. But notice the angle. It faces the lane, not along it. Whoever stood here was looking out for someone coming this way. Waiting for them, I should think. He looked at her sharply. Then this wasn't a chance meeting. Oh, very little in life is, she said, her voice as gentle as the morning mist. A flicker of movement caught her eye. A scrap of fabric tangled in the bramble. Graves reached for it, tugging free a torn piece of brown tweed. He turned it over in his hand, wet and muddied but unmistakable. Miss Marple did not speak, only tilted her head slightly, the faintest sigh escaping her lips. Back at the inn, the inspector's discovery spread like wildfire. Clara burst into tears, insisting Peter must be innocent, while Mrs. March whispered triumphantly that she had known it from the first. Major Bristow demanded fairness. Innocent until proven guilty, dash it all! But his voice was uncertain. Through it all, Miss Marple sat quietly, her expression unreadable. When Graves returned to question Hargreaves again, the man seemed resigned. Yes, it's my coat, he admitted, his voice low. But that doesn't mean I killed him. We argued, that's true. Latham had been with my firm for years. He accused me of stealing from a client's trust. Lies, ridiculous lies. I dismissed him on the spot. His hand shook as he rubbed his temple. He must have followed me here, hoping to make trouble. The inspector's pencil paused. So you did see him last night? Hargreaves looked up, eyes blazing. Briefly, yes, near the church. But he was alive when I left him, I swear it. Miss Marple, seated in the corner, spoke so softly it might have been to herself. Alive, yes, but frightened, perhaps. One wonders what frightened him most, the accusation or the truth behind it. The inspector glanced at her, but she said no more. Her gaze lingered instead on Clara, who had turned away, her shoulders shaking silently. And as Miss Marple rose to pour herself another cup of tea, she thought, not for the first time, that storms never truly end when the rain stops. Sometimes they continue quietly, behind drawn curtains, in the minds of those with something still to hide. The day stretched long and grey, the kind of dull afternoon that seemed to flatten sound and thought alike. The rain had eased to a faint drizzle, though a damp chill still clung to the air, seeping through coats and tempers. Inspector Graves had commandeered the small parlour at the Old Bell Inn as his temporary office, its once cheerful walls now heavy with suspicion. Guests came and went for questioning, their voices hushed, their eyes evasive. Outside, the church bell tolled noon, a sombre reminder that while the living fretted and speculated, the dead awaited explanation. Miss Marple had taken her usual seat by the window, knitting resting in her lap, though her fingers barely moved. From where she sat, she could see the lane stretching past the inn, the muddy tracks of constables' boots, and beyond that, the faint outline of Denham Cottage. Her mind worked quietly, sifting through details as neatly as sorting yarn by colour. The quarrel by the church, the missing coat, the clean shoes, each piece significant, yet the pattern incomplete. Clara descended the stairs with hesitant steps, her face pale and eyes rimmed with fatigue. She moved like one walking through a dream, every gesture slow, deliberate. Miss Marple beckoned her gently to sit. "You must try to eat something, my dear," she said, her tone kind but firm. "The body can bear only so much strain before the mind follows." Clara attempted a weak smile. "I couldn't swallow a thing, Miss Marple. It all feels so unreal. Peter insists he's innocent, but the inspector looks at him as though he's already condemned." She twisted a handkerchief between trembling fingers. "And poor Mr. Latham. He was always polite, always quiet. I can't imagine why anyone would wish him harm." Miss Marple studied her for a moment, then said gently, "People are rarely harmed for reasons one can easily imagine, my dear. More often, it's for reasons that seem too small to notice until it's far too late." There was a knock at the door, and the innkeeper, Mrs. Talbot, entered, flustered and breathless. "Begging pardon, Miss Marple, Inspector Graves sent word. He'd like you to come to the parlour. Says there's something you ought to see." Clara's eyes widened with dread, but Miss Marple only rose, smoothing her shawl. "Then we mustn't keep him waiting." When she entered the parlour, Graves was standing by the small writing desk near the window, a handful of papers spread before him. "We've been through Mr. Latham's things," he said without preamble. "Found these in his coat pocket, letters mostly, but one's rather curious." He handed her a folded sheet, its edges still damp. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and read in silence. The note was brief, written in a neat masculine hand. "Meet me by the church before the rain begins. There's something you must know before it's too late." She looked up slowly. So he was summoned there, and P could stand for Peter Hargreaves, I suppose. Graves nodded grimly. "It fits, though Hargreaves denies writing it. Claims he never sent such a message." Miss Marple tapped the letter thoughtfully against her palm. Then either someone wished it to seem he had, or someone else with a P had reason to draw Mr. Latham out. The inspector frowned. Another P? There's only Mrs. Pritchard, the vicar's wife, hardly the type to lure a young man to his death. Perhaps not, Miss Marple said mildly, though one should never discount human ingenuity, or desperation. Graves sighed, running a hand through his hair. We'll have the writing compared, but there's something else. One of the lads found a footprint near the cottage, a smaller one, perhaps a woman's. Fresh from that night. Seems someone else was out in the storm. Miss Marple's brows rose. Ah, then it isn't quite the tidy picture some would prefer. She moved toward the window, gazing out at the lane again. Women, Inspector, often go unnoticed when they move quietly enough, and yet it is women who most often know the truth before the men even realize there is one. Later that afternoon, as the villagers gathered in uneasy knots, the conversation turned darker. Mrs. March declared that Hargreaves would surely hang, while Mrs. Pritchard insisted on prayer and forgiveness, though her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. The Major, blustering, swore that the law would see reason. Through it all, Miss Marple sat listening, a silent observer among the noise. When Hargreaves entered briefly to fetch a glass of water, every voice faltered. The air thickened with unspoken judgment. He paused, his gaze brushing across the room, and for an instant it met Clara's. She tried to rise, but he turned away too quickly. Miss Marple noticed the faint smear of mud still clinging to his trouser cuff, a detail she stored away without comment. That evening, when most had retreated upstairs, she found herself once more by the fire. The inn had grown quiet, save for the occasional creak of settling wood. A shadow moved in the corridor, and Mrs. Pritchard appeared, shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. "Still awake, Miss Marple?" she asked softly. "Always, when there is something to be found," Miss Marple replied with a small smile. The vicar's wife hesitated, glancing about nervously. "I shouldn't say this, but you mustn't think Peter alone capable of deceit. That young man, Latham, he came to see me 2 days ago, asked about Miss Denham, said he feared she wasn't who she seemed. I told him he was mistaken, of course, but he left looking dreadfully troubled." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Did he indeed? How very interesting. And did he happen to mention why he thought so?" Mrs. Pritchard shook her head. "Only that he'd found something he meant to show Mr. Hargreaves. I thought it gossip, nothing more." Miss Marple leaned back, thoughtful. "Something to show? Yes, I dare say he did, and perhaps that's why he never reached Bath." She looked up at the older woman, her expression mild but knowing. "It's curious, isn't it, how secrets seem to gather before a storm, and how rarely they stay buried after." Outside, the wind had begun to rise again, whistling softly through the eaves, as though reminding the village that some tempests return until their work is done. The following morning dawned pale and brittle, the kind of cold that clung to the bones and made every sound feel louder than it should. Frost glistened on the hedgerows, and the village, still uneasy after the night's revelations, awoke with cautious curiosity. The news had spread. Mr. Latham's death was now being spoken of plainly as murder, and Peter Hargreaves' name hovered on every tongue, though few dared say it outright when Clara passed by. The girl moved like a ghost through the narrow streets, her composure cracking under the strain of whispered pity. At the Old Bell Inn, Inspector Graves sat at the breakfast table surrounded by reports. His heavy brows were furrowed, his tea untouched. Miss Marple entered quietly, carrying her knitting as usual. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, looking up. "I hoped you'd come. You've a way of noticing what others miss." She smiled faintly. "A habit formed from years of watching people, Inspector. I've always found they tell one more with their eyes than their mouths." He gestured toward the papers. The handwriting analysis came back. That note found in Latham's pocket. It wasn't written by Mr. Hargreaves. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "Indeed. Then the question becomes, who would wish it to appear so?" Graves nodded. "Someone who knew both men, certainly. Someone who wanted Latham to go to that church, and Hargreaves to look guilty when he didn't come back." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window, where a faint shape moved past. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Pritchard, hurrying along the lane toward the rectory, her gloved hands clutching something close to her chest. "You might begin," she said softly, "by asking who benefits from Mr. Latham's death. Murder is rarely committed without purpose, Inspector, though the purpose is often one that can't be spoken aloud." Before Graves could reply, Mrs. Talbot entered, cheeks flushed. "Inspector, sir, you're wanted at the church. The sexton's found something, says you'll want to see it straight away." Graves rose, his chair scraping the floor. "Come along, Miss Marple. You've the sharpest eyes of anyone in this village." The churchyard lay hushed beneath a pale sky. The graveyard soil was dark and damp, dotted with patches of frost. Near the lych gate the sexton waited, hat in hand, his expression grim. "Found it just now, sir," he said, pointing toward the low wall by the path. "Caught my boot on it." Graves bent down. Half buried in the mud lay a small object, metallic, glinting faintly in the light. He wiped away the dirt with his handkerchief and revealed a key ring. Its silver dull with grime. Hanging from it was a single tag engraved with initials, P.H. "Peter Hargreaves again," the inspector muttered. Miss Marple crouched beside him, her eyes sharp. Curious, isn't it, that this should appear now, so conveniently after the storm has passed, and yet the soil's not disturbed enough to suggest it was dropped days ago. It was placed, Inspector. Someone wanted it found. Graves frowned. "You're suggesting a frame-up." "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said mildly, "that deceit is often tidier than truth, and that our murderer may have an uncommon sense of timing." As they returned toward the village, a sudden cry broke the stillness. Clara came running from the inn, clutching a crumpled paper in her hand. "Inspector!" "Miss Marple, look, this was slipped under my door last night." Her voice trembled as she handed it over. The note was hastily scrawled, the ink blotted by nervous fingers. "You think you know the truth, but you don't. Ask about the Denham inheritance. Ask what Latham discovered before he died." Graves read it twice, then exhaled slowly. "The Denham inheritance. What's that supposed to mean?" Miss Marple looked at Clara, whose confusion seemed genuine. "You've no knowledge of any such inheritance, my dear?" "None at all," Clara whispered. "My parents were simple people. There's nothing to inherit." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her for a long moment. Then she turned to the inspector. "Perhaps not in the legal sense, Inspector, but names and identities have value too. And if someone were living under one not rightfully theirs, well, that might be motive enough to kill a man who discovered it." Clara gasped. "You think I—" "Oh no, Miss Marple, I swear." "My dear," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "I think nothing yet. I only observe. And what I observe is that someone very much wishes to see you frightened." That afternoon, while the inspector followed up on old parish records, Miss Marple made her way quietly to the rectory. The vicar's wife greeted her with surprise, though not displeasure. "Miss Marple, do come in out of the cold." A cup of tea? Thank you, dear, said Miss Marple, settling by the hearth. Such dreadful business, isn't it? Though I've always said storms bring out the best and worst in us. I wonder, did you know Miss Denham's family well? Mrs. Pritchard hesitated, her teacup halfway to her lips. Not well, no. She came here recently after all. Why do you ask? Oh, idle curiosity, Miss Marple said pleasantly. It's just that one hears odd things, about inheritances, for instance. I imagine her background has stirred more interest than she realizes. The vicar's wife set her cup down carefully. Nonsense. A quiet girl. Hardly the type for secrets. But her voice had tightened ever so slightly. Miss Marple smiled. You're quite right, of course, and yet I always find the quiet ones the most intriguing. People underestimate them, you see, and sometimes that's precisely how mischief begins. When she left the rectory, the light was fading, the air filled with the caw of distant rooks. She walked slowly back toward the inn, her thoughts weaving threads together. Someone had known of Mr. Latham's discovery. Someone who feared exposure, who used deceit with care and subtlety. And somewhere beneath all the whispers, the truth waited patiently, like a letter never posted, waiting for the right hand to deliver it. Miss Marple tightened her shawl and allowed herself a small, knowing smile. People, she murmured softly to the empty lane, always think they can bury the past, but the earth, like conscience, has a way of turning things up again. Evening settled once more over St. Aldhelm's Rest, the pale sky giving way to mist and a hush that seemed to creep along the streets. The village had grown weary of its own gossip. Whispers now carried a nervous edge, as though the townsfolk feared their words might somehow summon more misfortune. Inside the Old Bell Inn, a low fire glowed in the hearth, its warmth flickering across the tired faces of those who remained. Miss Marple sat near the window as always, the faint rhythm of her knitting needles a small steady sound amid the murmurs of unease. Inspector Graves entered, his boots leaving dark marks on the rug. He looked older than he had that morning, his jaw set, his eyes shadowed by thought. Miss Marple, he said, lowering himself into the chair opposite her. I've spent half the day at the county archives. Seems there was a Denham inheritance, though it's an old one. Some property left unclaimed when a cousin of Clara's died in Devon 20 years ago. The estate's worth a tidy sum now, thanks to development in the area. Miss Marple's eyes glimmered with quiet interest. How curious. And has Miss Denham made any claim to it? She hasn't, Graves replied, and from what I can tell, she doesn't even know it exists. But here's where it gets peculiar. The records list a living heir under the name Clara Denham, but that's not our Miss Denham at all. The birth records don't match. Someone used her name. Miss Marple nodded slightly, her gaze lowering to her knitting. So poor Mr. Latham may have discovered this deception, and whoever stood to gain from it could not allow him to speak. That's the theory, Graves agreed, but proving it's another matter. The only one with the resources to pull off such a scheme would be Hargreaves himself. He's clever enough, and as her fiancé, he'd stand to benefit most. Miss Marple looked up, her blue eyes calm but sharp. Perhaps, yet deceit on that scale requires confidence. The sort of confidence that comes from knowing one won't be questioned. No, Inspector, I rather think Mr. Hargreaves is too harried a man for such a performance. Someone else is using his shadow to hide their own. A silence stretched between them, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Then the innkeeper's wife appeared in the doorway, twisting her apron nervously. "Inspector, sir, there's someone asking for you. Says he's from Bath. Brought a parcel addressed to Miss Denham." Moments later, A messenger was shown in, dripping from the rain. He handed over a brown paper parcel, the handwriting elegant and unfamiliar. Clara's name was written in bold ink across the front. She entered hesitantly when called, her hands trembling as she accepted it. "It must be a mistake," she murmured. "I don't know anyone in Bath." "Open it," Graves instructed. Clara carefully untied the string and peeled back the paper. Inside lay a small, leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with neat columns of names and numbers. At the top of the first page, written in the same hand as the parcel's label, were the words Denham & Co. Estate accounts. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "How very obliging of someone to send you precisely what the inspector has been searching for." Graves frowned. "We'll have it examined. Might be genuine, or a trap." He turned to the messenger. "Who gave you this?" "Didn't catch his name, sir," the man replied uneasily. "Gentleman in a grey coat. Said it was urgent. Gave me a shilling extra to make certain it arrived tonight. Grey coat," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Not tweed, I presume?" The messenger shook his head. "No, miss. Plain grey wool. Tall fellow. Soft voice." Graves dismissed him, but Miss Marple's expression had changed ever so slightly. An almost imperceptible tightening of the mouth, a quiet spark of realization in her eyes. "Inspector," she said gently, "doesn't the vicar wear a grey coat of just that description?" Graves blinked. "Reverend Pritchard? Surely not. The man's been here 20 years, steady as the church clock." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, returning to her knitting. "And yet clocks can lose time, Inspector, sometimes gradually, so that no one notices until they are quite out of sync with the world around them." That evening, while the inspector examined the ledger, Miss Marple took a quiet walk through the village. The air was crisp, the ground still damp, and lamps glowed faintly behind lace curtains. She passed the rectory, its windows dark except for a faint light from the study. The door was slightly ajar. Curiosity, that old familiar tug, drew her closer. Inside, the vicar sat at his desk, his head bowed over a stack of letters. His wife hovered nearby, her face tense, her hands twisting a handkerchief. Miss Marple stood in the doorway unnoticed, listening to the low murmur of their conversation. "She's bound to find out," Mrs. Pritchard was saying. "That ledger's gone. Someone will connect it to you." The vicar's reply was tight, angry. "I did what had to be done. The inheritance was meant for charity, not squandered by strangers. Latham discovered too much, but I never meant—" He stopped abruptly, his shoulders heaving. It was supposed to frighten him off, not kill him. A floorboard creaked beneath Miss Marple's foot, and both heads turned sharply. The vicar rose, pale and trembling. "Miss Marple," he stammered, "this isn't what it looks like." She regarded him quietly, her face unreadable. "I rather think it's exactly what it looks like, Reverend, and I imagine Inspector Graves would be very interested to hear the rest." Mrs. Pritchard gave a strangled cry, covering her face. "He never meant to kill the boy. It was an accident. The argument got out of hand. He struck him only once." The vicar sank back into his chair, defeated. "I thought if it seemed Hargreaves had done it, the matter would end there. God forgive me, I thought I could put it right before anyone knew." Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "Deceit, Reverend, is like a cracked bell. However softly it rings, the sound is always wrong." She stepped back into the cool night, leaving behind the muffled sobs of the vicar's wife and the hollow stillness of a man who had mistaken righteousness for justification. The mist thickened as she walked, the village silent once more, and in that silence she thought of poor Mr. Latham, too honest for his own safety, too perceptive for a world that often punished truth. When she returned to the inn, Graves looked up from the ledger. "You've been out?" he asked. "Yes," she said simply, removing her shawl. "And I believe your case, Inspector, is about to conclude itself." He stared at her, puzzled. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Only that sometimes the Lord works in mysterious ways, and sometimes he allows a vicar to confess before breakfast. As true to Miss Marple's quiet prediction, morning brought confession. The sun rose pale and thin over the thatched roofs, glinting faintly on puddles that dotted the cobbled street. Word spread quickly that the vicar had gone to the constable's office at first light, his face drawn, his coat unbuttoned, as though he had forgotten the day's chill. Inspector Graves received him there, and the confession that followed was halting, remorseful, and incomplete in ways Miss Marple had anticipated. By mid-morning, St. Aldhelm's Rest had its culprit, or so it seemed. The inspector sat in the inn's parlour once more, his hands clasped before him. Fatigue etched into every line of his face. Miss Marple entered softly, the morning light tracing the edges of her shawl. "So it is done, then?" she asked. Graves nodded grimly. "He's admitted to striking Latham, claims it was in a moment of anger, that the young man threatened to expose the misuse of those charity funds. Says the blow wasn't meant to kill." "And yet it did," Miss Marple said quietly. Graves exhaled. He panicked, tried to drag the body off the path, then ran when he heard someone approaching. Later, he realized the scene might point to Hargreaves, and he let it. He rubbed his temple. He's ruined himself, and for what? Misguided loyalty to some imagined good. Miss Marple sank gently into the chair opposite. "It's curious, Inspector, how people convince themselves wrongdoing can serve righteousness. Once one steps down that path, the ground gives way so very easily." Graves looked at her keenly. "You don't think he's lying, do you?" She hesitated, her gaze turning thoughtful. "No, not entirely. He struck the blow, yes. But I wonder whether he struck it alone?" The inspector frowned. "You mean Mrs. Pritchard? She's distraught, certainly, but she insists she knew nothing until after?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, "though I have known women who know without knowing, who look away not from ignorance, but from fear of seeing too clearly." Her eyes drifted to the window, where Clara Denham stood outside, speaking softly with Peter Hargreaves. "Still, there are things that don't quite fit, don't you think? The ledger's sudden arrival, for one. The timing was too precise, the handwriting too controlled for a man who'd spent the night racked with guilt. I rather suspect it was meant to direct suspicion where the Reverend himself could not bear to look." Graves rose, pacing. "Then who sent it? Someone who wished to tie the knot a little tighter around another neck." Miss Marple replied mildly. "It's an old story, Inspector, one lie concealing another. But if I may make a suggestion, I'd ask that you look again at the ledger itself. Not what it says, but what it omits." The inspector gave her a puzzled glance, but left without argument. Miss Marple remained by the fire, her knitting untouched. She was thinking of the vicar's words the night before. His claim that the money had been intended for charity. There had been no greed in his confession, only fear and misguided pride. But somewhere nearby lurked a hand more deliberate, one that understood precisely how to manipulate such pride. An hour later, Graves returned, his face pale. "You were right. The ledger's false. Beautifully forged, but false. The estate accounts listed are genuine enough, but the trail of signatures leads back to someone entirely different. The final authorization, the one transferring the funds, belongs to Mrs. Pritchard." Miss Marple gave a small, sorrowful nod. "Ah, I feared as much. The good lady has always been most efficient in church matters. Too efficient, perhaps. It seems she found a way to justify keeping what she thought her husband deserved, and when young Mr. Latham discovered her cleverness, she let him meet his death rather than face disgrace. The inspector sat heavily. But if he didn't die by her hand, she didn't need to kill him herself. Miss Marple interrupted softly. She only needed to send him to her husband, a note perhaps, written in the Reverend's name, telling the boy to meet him before the storm. She must have thought her husband would scare him into silence, and when the blow went too far, she convinced herself the sin was his alone. Graves's jaw tightened. And the parcel? A final act of preservation, Miss Marple said. The ledger sent anonymously to Clara was her doing, I think, an attempt to muddy the water further. But she forgot that lies, like letters, carry the imprint of their sender. Ink, handwriting, phrasing, they reveal more than people realize. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the church bell began to toll the hour, each note slow and mournful. At last Graves rose, weary but resolute. "I'll fetch her," he said. "God help the both of them." When the inspector had gone, Miss Marple gathered her knitting, folding it neatly into her bag. She felt no triumph, only the quiet melancholy that came with understanding human frailty too well. Outside, she found Clara and Peter still standing by the gate. The young man's face was drawn, but there was relief in it too. A man who had glimpsed ruin and now saw a path clear again. Clara looked up as Miss Marple approached, her eyes red but grateful. "It's over then?" she asked softly. "In a manner of speaking," Miss Marple replied. "The truth has a way of settling itself once it's given room." She paused, studying the girl's pale face. "But you must be gentle with yourself, my dear. Innocence, once brushed by tragedy, seldom feels as light as before. Still, you've your life ahead, and I dare say that's something worth treasuring." Clara nodded, tears welling again. "I don't know how to thank you, Miss Marple." "By living kindly," Miss Marple said simply. "That's thanks enough." As she turned to go, a gust of wind stirred the last of the leaves across the lane. The village would return to its rhythm soon. The church bells, the gossip, the quiet routines. But the memory of this storm would linger, as all storms do, in the hearts of those who had weathered it. Miss Marple walked on toward her cottage, the air cool and still now, her thoughts steady and untroubled. Another mystery resolved, another lesson confirmed, that no crime, however small or cloaked in virtue, could escape the quiet persistence of truth, or the patient eyes of one old lady who understood human nature far too well. The afternoon that followed was heavy with quiet. The storm had passed, the truth had surfaced, and yet St. Aldhelm's Rest seemed unable to breathe again. The village existed in that uneasy stillness that comes after the breaking of something long held intact. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the last yellow leaves across the cobbles, whispering through the empty lane that led from the rectory to the churchyard. Inside the inn, murmured fragments of conversation drifted from room to room, each recounting the tale in its own fashion, each softening or sharpening it to suit the teller's temperament. Miss Marple, who had spent the better part of the morning providing a calm word here and there, now sat once more by the hearth, her knitting on her lap. The inspector had gone to the magistrate with his report, and the vicar and his wife were both in custody at the constable's office. Yet Miss Marple's expression held no satisfaction, only thoughtfulness, tinged with something like pity. For in her long experience she had learned that truth, once revealed, rarely left its subjects untouched. It did not set people free as they liked to believe. It merely exchanged one kind of burden for another. Clara entered quietly, carrying a tray of tea, her movements subdued but steady. "Mrs. Talbot said you hadn't eaten," she said softly. "I thought perhaps you might take a cup." "How kind of you, my dear," Miss Marple replied, setting her knitting aside. "I must say, you've borne yourself admirably through all of this. Most young women would have collapsed beneath so much unpleasantness." Clara gave a faint smile that faltered almost at once. I don't feel admirable, Miss Marple. Just tired. I keep thinking of them, the Pritchards. They seemed so respectable. I never would have imagined." "Respectability," Miss Marple said gently, "is very much like lace. Delicate, pretty, and often used to conceal rather a lot beneath. One learns with age to look through it rather than at it. Clara looked down at her hands, twisting her handkerchief absently. "Do you think people will forgive them? The vicar and his wife?" "Forgive, yes," Miss Marple said, pouring the tea with care. "Forget, never. The village will carry it quietly for years, like a scar under a glove. But time softens even the sharpest edges, and there is mercy in that, if not full absolution." They sat in silence for a moment, the sound of the clock filling the space between them. Then Clara said suddenly, "Miss Marple, you were right about the letter Mr. Latham received, the one signed with P. It wasn't the vicar, was it?" "Not really." Miss Marple's eyes met hers, serene but penetrating. "No, my dear. The Reverend was not the author of that letter. It was his wife who wrote it, using his initial. It was she who sent Mr. Latham to his death, without laying a hand upon him. A woman's hand, you see, is often invisible in such things, but rarely absent." Clara shivered. "But why send the ledger afterwards? Why risk exposure?" "To protect what she loved most," Miss Marple said softly. "Her husband. She thought by sending that parcel she could redirect suspicion toward you, or your fiancé, and thereby spare him. It was foolish, of course, and desperate. But desperation, like love, blinds more efficiently than hatred ever could." Clara said nothing. The fire crackled softly, and for a while the only movement was Miss Marple's hand stirring her tea. Outside footsteps approached, and the door opened to admit Inspector Graves, his face drawn but resolute. "It's finished," he said simply. "They've both confessed. She admitted to forging the letter and the ledger. He confessed to the blow. It will go easier for him, I think. The magistrate was moved by her loyalty, misguided as it was." He sighed, sinking into the chair opposite Miss Marple. "You were right from the start, of course. I suppose I ought to be used to that by now." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It's not a matter of being right, Inspector, only of seeing clearly. The difficulty is that most people see only what they expect, and nothing more." Graves rubbed the bridge of his nose, exhaustion etched in every movement. "A nasty business. Still, I suppose it could have been worse. Poor Latham. He deserved better." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice low. "He was an honest young man, and honesty, I fear, is a dangerous quality when it stumbles upon corruption. It's a sort of candle, you know. It lights what others would rather keep in shadow." The inspector nodded, then rose, tipping his hat to Clara. "I'll be off then. There's paperwork to see to, and London wants the full report by evening. Miss Marple, my thanks as always." When he was gone, Clara lingered by the window, watching him stride down the lane. "Do you think people like that ever find peace?" she asked softly. "Oh, yes," Miss Marple replied after a pause, "though not the kind they imagine. Peace, my dear, is rarely granted all at once. It comes slowly, like spring after a long frost, one thawed heart at a time." Later, as twilight deepened and the village settled into its nightly quiet, Miss Marple took a solitary walk. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of wood smoke and wet earth. The church stood still and solemn against the fading sky, its bell silent now. She paused by the low stone wall where the tragedy had begun. The ground was clean again, the traces of struggle washed away by rain and time. But in her mind she saw it clearly. The fear in the young man's eyes, the anger in the vicar's, the anguish in the woman who had watched too much for too long. It was a simple thing. She thought how easily one life could unravel the pretences of many, and yet beneath all the sorrow she felt a strange calm. The truth, however painful, had been spoken. The village would heal, and life, small and ordinary but precious, would resume its gentle rhythm. As she turned toward home, the first stars emerged through the thinning clouds. She drew her shawl close, her steps steady along the quiet path. People would come to her in days to come, asking softly for details, for meaning, for reassurance that good still outweighed evil. She would give them comfort, as she always did, but she would also remind them that wickedness seldom arrives with thunder or drama. More often, it walks beside virtue, borrowing its face. And with that thought, she smiled faintly to herself and disappeared into the dim evening, leaving behind only the faint click of her heels and the lingering warmth of a mind that understood better than most that the true mystery of life was not in how people sinned, but why they chose to. The next morning broke soft and golden, as if the village itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. A pale mist hovered over the fields, curling between hedgerows and drifting through the churchyard like a gentle ghost reluctant to leave. St. Aldhelm's Rest was quieter than usual, subdued, though beneath the hush there lingered that subtle energy which always follows calamity, a collective need to talk, to make sense of what could never truly be understood. Miss Marple woke early, as was her habit, and drew back the curtains of her small bedroom at the Old Bell Inn. The air that met her was cool and fresh, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and burning wood. She stood there for a moment, watching as a milk cart rumbled past, its driver raising a hand in greeting. Everything, it seemed, was beginning to return to normal, or what passed for normal in a village that had seen its first murder in decades. Downstairs, Mrs. Talbot was already bustling about, clattering dishes and talking more loudly than necessary, as if determined to drown out the memory of the past days. When Miss Marple appeared, she was greeted with exaggerated cheer. "Good morning, Miss Marple. A fine day, isn't it? Though I dare say it'll be talked about for years. What with the Pritchards and all." Miss Marple smiled faintly as she took her seat by the window. "Yes, indeed, Mrs. Talbot. Such things tend to grow with the telling. I expect by next month it will be said the poor vicar ran a smuggling ring in his spare time." The innkeeper laughed too quickly, grateful for levity, and hurried off with the teapot. Miss Marple poured her tea, her thoughts drifting as steam rose before her. The storm had passed, the culprits confessed, and yet her mind lingered uneasily upon the fine threads of the affair. The vicar's guilt was certain, his wife's deceit proven, and yet the pattern of it, the way the crime had woven itself through secrecy, guilt, and love, left her troubled, not because she doubted the outcome, but because it reminded her how delicate human decency truly was. She had seen such things before. Respectable people led astray by pride or fear, small acts of concealment growing monstrous under pressure. Evil, she had often said, did not always wear horns or carry knives. It could look like devotion, sound like duty, and feel like love. The door opened quietly, and Clara Denham stepped in, wrapped in a light grey cloak. Her face was pale, but the haunted look had softened. "I didn't mean to disturb you," she said softly. "Peter's gone to the solicitor's in town. I wanted to thank you before we leave." Miss Marple looked up kindly. "Leaving, my dear? So soon?" Clara nodded. "Peter thinks it best. The school can find another mistress. We'll go to Bath for a while, perhaps start afresh. I don't think I could bear the whispers here." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said gently. "Villages have long memories, though they mean no harm by it. It's only their way of holding on to what excites them." She reached across the table and patted Clara's hand. "A change will do you good. But don't let this experience make you distrustful of others. We mustn't let the failings of a few harden our hearts to the rest." Clara managed a tremulous smile. "I'll try not to. I'll remember what you said. The truth has to be faced, even when it hurts. It's better than living under lies." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Lies are like dust. They settle quietly at first, but left too long, they choke everything." They spoke for a while longer, about the journey ahead, about Peter's determination to rebuild his name, about the future that might yet hold peace. When Clara finally rose to leave, Miss Marple embraced her with a tenderness that surprised even herself. There was something fragile yet resilient about the girl, like a wildflower that had managed to grow between stones. After she had gone, the inn grew still again. Miss Marple sat for a long time in silence, her tea forgotten, her thoughts turning to the vicar and his wife. She pictured them in their separate cells, he perhaps praying, she perhaps weeping, and felt that curious mix of sorrow and resignation that always followed the end of such matters. Justice had been done, yes, but justice, in her mind, was never pure triumph. It was only the restoration of balance, and balance always came at a cost. By afternoon, Inspector Graves returned briefly to settle accounts and make arrangements for the transfer of the prisoners. He looked worn, but when he saw Miss Marple, his expression softened. "You've done it again," he said, shaking his head. "I'll never understand how you manage to see what everyone else overlooks. She smiled modestly. "It isn't cleverness, Inspector, only observation. People are much the same everywhere. One learns the patterns." He chuckled. "Patterns, is it? Well, I'll say this. If I ever find myself in trouble, I hope you're on my side." "I dare say I would be," she replied, "provided you deserved it." When he left, she walked him to the door, watching as he mounted his horse and rode off toward the crossroads. The last light of day stretched long across the road, gilding the hedges and softening the grey stones of the cottages. For the first time in days, the village felt at peace again, not untouched, but quieter, cleansed in a way only truth could achieve. As dusk fell, Miss Marple returned to her knitting by the fire. The room glowed with the gentle orange of the hearth, and the shadows danced along the walls. She thought of all she had seen over the years, of murders born not of hatred, but of fear, of lies told not for gain, but for protection, of human weakness dressed up as virtue. And through it all, she saw again what she always saw, the delicate, intricate web of human nature, so easily torn, so endlessly repaired. Outside, the church bell tolled once more, solemn but steady, as if reminding the village that life would go on. Miss Marple listened, her fingers resuming their quiet work. The pattern grew beneath her hands, neat and precise, each stitch following the last in perfect order. "Yes," she murmured to herself, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Life does have a way of knitting itself together again." And with that, she smiled faintly, the kind of smile that belonged to someone who understood the world in all its cruelty and kindness, and loved it still. The fire crackled softly, the night deepened, and St. Aldhelm's Rest, wrapped once more in calm, drifted gently towards its next ordinary day. The following Sunday dawned bright and clear, the sky a soft blue that seemed to wash the last traces of storm from memory. The church bell tolled again, just as it always had, though this time its sound carried an echo of melancholy through the village. St. Aldhelm's Rest was itself once more. Tidy gardens trimmed, gossip politely subdued, and life returning to its gentle rhythm. Yet beneath the familiar calm, something had changed. People now spoke in quieter tones, with a new respect for how easily shadows could slip beneath even the neatest hedges. Miss Marple sat in the back pew of the church, her small frame almost lost among the oak benches. She had come not out of piety, though she was devout enough, but out of habit. It pleased her to observe the village at worship, to see how people wore their virtue, how they spoke of forgiveness while glancing sidelong at one another, measuring sincerity as one might measure sugar for tea. The vicar's replacement, a mild young curate from the next parish, gave a trembling sermon about repentance and renewal. The congregation listened dutifully, though their minds wandered. Mrs. March dabbed at her eyes, as though she herself had narrowly escaped scandal. Major Bristow coughed with exaggerated solemnity. Clara and Peter, seated together near the front, held hands discreetly, their faces composed but faintly wistful. Time had begun its slow work of healing. When the service ended, Miss Marple remained seated, watching as the villagers filed out, their murmurs rising and fading beneath the vaulted roof. She found herself thinking once more of the Pritchards. He would face judgment soon, both earthly and otherwise, and she hoped he would find peace in the honesty he had at last embraced. As for his wife, her part in the deception had been quieter, but no less tragic. It was always the same, Miss Marple reflected. Evil rarely announced itself with fanfare. It crept in softly, disguised as virtue, until good people found themselves doing harm for the sake of what they called love. Outside the air was bright and still. A few children chased each other near the churchyard wall, their laughter echoing through the crisp morning. Life went on as it must. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes soft with understanding. People would soon speak of other things. The harvest, the school fete, perhaps even weddings, and this grim affair would fade into the background of village history, where all tragedies eventually settled like dust on a shelf. As she walked slowly down the lane, her cane tapping lightly against the cobblestones, she met Inspector Graves coming the other way. He looked unusually cheerful, though a little sheepish. "Miss Marple," he called, tipping his hat. "Off to lunch, are you? I thought I might catch you before I head back to town." "Ah, Inspector," she said pleasantly. "I was just thinking of you. I trust all is well." "Better than I'd hoped," he replied. "Hargreaves has been cleared completely. Seems he and Miss Denham plan to marry quietly in Bath. As for the Pritchards, well, it'll be a hard trial, but at least the truth's known now. I've seen worse endings." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Far worse." She regarded him with mild affection. "You've done well, Inspector. Few men in your position would have had the patience to see beyond the obvious." He laughed. "Patience? No, Miss Marple, that was yours. You always see what hides in plain sight." "Not always," she corrected gently. "But I do try to remember that wickedness, like goodness, seldom exists in pure form. People are mixtures, Inspector. Motives tangle. We act from love, from pride, from fear. And often we don't know which is which until it's far too late." He nodded thoughtfully. "A wise way of putting it. Still, I'd rather have you on my side than against me in any case." She smiled, eyes twinkling. "Then you must be very careful, Inspector, never to find yourself on the wrong side." He laughed again, tipped his hat once more, and went on his way, whistling faintly as he disappeared around the bend. Miss Marple watched him go, the corners of her mouth still curved in that knowing little smile. Then, turning toward the village green, she continued at her steady pace. The autumn light fell gently through the trees, gilding the leaves in shades of gold and amber. Everything looked so peaceful that one could almost forget how fragile such peace was, how easily it could be fractured by a single unkind act or unguarded word. But Miss Marple never forgot. That was her gift and her burden. She understood that in every human heart there lived the potential for both cruelty and compassion, and that the balance between them was as delicate as the thread in her knitting. She reached her cottage by early afternoon, where the kettle awaited its familiar task. As the water began to hum and the clock ticked quietly in the corner, she settled into her chair by the window, her knitting needles resuming their steady, comforting rhythm. Each stitch fell into place, neat and certain, weaving order from chaos, peace from turmoil, just as she always did. Outside, the church bell chimed once, then fell silent. Miss Marple looked up from her work, a faint smile touching her lips. "Another storm weathered," she murmured to herself, "and another small corner of the world set right." The fire crackled softly. A single leaf drifted past the window, and St. Aldhelm's Rest, calm and golden once more, continued on, forever watched over by the quiet mind and gentle wisdom of an old lady who knew, better than anyone, that truth was never truly hidden, only waiting for the right eyes to see it. Right eyes to see it.